Hello everyone, Lordy here. Welcome to the new channel, Haunt and Hunt. The next few videos you'll see are older videos I did a few years ago, but still relevant to this channel. So I hope you do enjoy them, and plenty of new ones will be coming out over the next few weeks. Buckle in, some dark stuff. So immediately I'll ask you to like when you do like this video, and please subscribe and hit that bell notification to stay up to date on these cases. You will find some of these stories interesting, scary, and at times heartbreaking. Often the subjects of my videos are referred to as monsters, but that's completely false. Monsters aren't real. These people are. Now, the first case I'd like to cover in this first ever episode involves a serial killer that has been made even more famous recently thanks to a TV series written by Ryan Murphy. I'm sure by now you'll have already guessed who it could be. Jeffrey Dahmer was an American serial killer who murdered and dismembered 17 young men and boys between the years of 1978 and 1991. And what makes all of these horrific crimes even more horrific, the clue is in his alias, the Milwaukee Cannibal. He ate a number of the victims' body parts and even kept some of them for his own ritualistic purposes, which you're going to find out in this video. Now, before we get too much into the detail, I'd like to make a slight disclaimer about what's coming up. This allows you to make a conscious decision to leave now, and hopefully we'll see you on a future video. The story involves murder, dismemberment, cannibalism, and paedophilia. Please leave now if any of that will cause you upset or any offence, or act as a trigger for any memories or experience you also have. For everyone else that has stayed, sit back, relax, dim the lights. This is Jeffrey Dahmer's story. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born May the 21st, 1960 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and was the eldest of two sons of Joyce and Lionel Dahmer. It was theorized that Dahmer's abandonment issues first flourished at an early age, as his father Lionel was still a chemistry student that spent a lot of time away from the family home, and his mother Joyce was a hypochondriac that spent a lot of time in bed or having random arguments with neighbours over the smallest of things. However, there are conflicting arguments from various sources that say he was actually doted a lot on growing up, but the clear and consistent resources state that his mother Joyce was always greedy for attention and would do anything to get it, including attempting a fake suicide on a number of occasions, which is sure to have a massive impact on the boy. Even at elementary school, which here in the UK we call primary school, which is between the ages of 5 and 11, Dahmer was considered a quiet and timid child. One teacher even said that she thought she'd noticed early signs of abandonment issues in him, which actually got progressively worse when his younger brother David was born. Even by 8 years old, Dahmer had already experienced living in 3 different family homes in Ohio and Wisconsin, which, on the grand scheme of things, isn't that awful? A lot of us have experienced that. These were his formative years, and that sort of uncertainty can have a detrimental impact on children. He was already known to have only a small group of friends, so this constant moving couldn't have done any benefit to his childhood friendship circles. Added to this, and foreshadowing what would turn into the most gruesome crimes in his adult life, Dahmer developed a fascination with dead animals. His first encounter and subsequent revelation of this interest was when his father Lionel was clearing some animal remains from the bottom of their house. His father later commented that Dahmer would be oddly thrilled by the bones and would refer to them as his fiddlesticks, coming up with macabre games to play with them. In one of his houses there was an acre of land behind, which included a hut, and in that hut he used to collect large insects such as dragonflies and moths and the skeletons of smaller animals like chipmunks and squirrels. Ever the curious child, he learned from his father, who was a chemist, that he could keep the animals preserved in formaldehyde. He'd even started to collect roadkill and dissect these, as he had, again, an odd interest in how animals were put together. Now, I'm all for exploring your curiosities, but when I was a kid, I was more interested in collecting Action Man figurines than dissecting animals. But again, that's probably an indicator of what happened later on. Sadly, during his teenage years, Dahmer only further went downhill, which isn't surprising if you add hormonal teenage feeling to an already macabre psychological cooking pot. The result isn't going to be pretty. I'm sure you'll agree. And it showed. By the age of 14, he'd already started to drink beer heavily. You know, this wasn't just the odd can here and there, like, you know, some of us have been guilty of growing up. But whole packs of beer, 4 or 6 at a time, on a daily basis. At 14, that's going to have an impact. He'd even conceal it in his clothes during classes and drink it during a class. Now, this wasn't to say he was a complete outcast, as you know, teachers at the school and staff would readily admit that they thought Dahmer a quiet and polite child that, you know, was quite intelligent, despite his failing grades. He was even a keen tennis player and participated in the school band at one point too. But hindsight is an amazing thing, and when you reflect on these tiny details, they're common psychopathic traits. Short-term interest in projects. So there are all these minor details that now we can pick up on, but at the time, it's just another phase for a child. Now, by the time Dahmer had hit puberty, he wasn't just battling these feelings towards animals and bones and all the other interests and hobbies he had, but he also realized he was gay. You know, so I can't even begin to imagine how difficult it was for him growing up during the 60s and the 70s when homophobia was rampant. I mean, it's still pretty bad today in places, but back then, it must have been very difficult for him. I mean, same-sex sexual intercourse was still illegal in some states until 2003. Add this to his parents getting a divorce, the family being separated in the same year that Dahmer graduated. You can almost understand his state of mind at the time. It was pretty broken up. Now, this is in no way a defense of his actions, but as I said, I like to delve into the psychology a bit more and try to understand, because like I said, monsters don't exist, these are people. How did it happen? How did they get to that point? But sadly, it'd be only 3 weeks after Dahmer's graduation before he claimed his first victim. On the 18th of June 1978, Dahmer was driving around randomly when he spotted a hitchhiker, Stephen Mark Hicks. Later admitting he was sexually aroused by Stephen's bare chest, Dahmer was more than happy to help him out with a ride. He's a 18-year-old bloke, so hormones again. Stephen was actually the same age as Dahmer, 18, and was known to be in very good shape, so it was not surprising that Dahmer took a liking to him immediately. Hicks told Dahmer that he was actually hitchhiking to meet some of his friends at a rock concert at Chippewa Lake Park in Ohio. So Dahmer said he'd give him a ride, but he mentioned that he had his family house all to himself, so they should go back, drink a few beers and chill out, and then Dahmer would take him on to his friends later. Hicks, with no real reason to be concerned about his safety, his immediate safety, with his unassuming teenager, got into Dahmer's car and went back to his house with him. After several hours of drinking and Hicks talking about girls, Hicks wanted to leave, and Dahmer realised that any sexual advances he made on this guy would be rebuffed. The guy was clearly straight. Hicks really wanted to leave. Dahmer put up some reasoning why they shouldn't leave. Hicks got angry. There was a bit of an argument and Hicks went to leave. They'd been working out in the living room at the time where they'd been drinking. And near where they were was this 10-pound, sort of 4.5 kilogram dumbbell weight, Now, whilst it's not super heavy, being swung at the speed that Dahmer did it and the anger he must have felt at the time, fueled by alcohol, it definitely caused some damage. According to Dahmer, it took 2 hits to knock Hicks unconscious before, and again, this is going to be quite graphic, Dahmer strangled Hicks to death with the actual barbell itself, the piece of metal in between the 2 weights. Once he knew Hicks was dead, Dahmer stripped the boy naked, explored his chest, which had grabbed his interest in the first place. And this next part is pretty graphic. Dahmer then masturbated over Hicks's body, which kind of fits in to the narrative of his need to control and dominate. Again, this next stages are pretty graphic. Dahmer then put all of his taxidermy experience to use in the disposal of Hicks's body, but like most serial killers' first kill, there was a kind of a rawness to it, as he was trying to find his MO, his reason for doing it, his process. He first dismembered Hicks in the family basement before burying his remains in a shallow grave in the back garden. Now, several weeks later, after Dahmer realised that this wasn't a long-term solution, he would get found out, he dug Hicks's remains up and pared the flesh from the bones. Now, what paring means is actually quite graphic, so just please bear with me. You can probably imagine what it is based on paring from the bones. Effectively, he skinned the remains of Hicks. He then dissolved the skin in acid and flushed it down the toilet. Yep, the same toilet that he used in the family house. He then crushed the bones with a sledgehammer before scattering them in the woods behind the family home. So sadly, Stephen Marks Hicks became Jeffrey Dahmer's first victim. It'd been 9 years until Dahmer next killed. During this period, in his downtime, Dahmer enrolled at Ohio State University, which his father had contributed towards helping him pay for, to get out of his alcohol-fueled spiral downwards. After failing considerably, Dahmer dropped out in his second term. The only class I think he passed was in rifle shooting, which is a really interesting class to have at a university. Angry at his son's continual disregard for any help that him and his new stepmom had shown him, Lionel demanded that Dahmer joined the US Army. And by July of 1979, when Dahmer was 19, he actually, for the first time I think in his life, successfully passed something. He passed basic training and joined the 2nd Battalion, 68th Armoured Regiment, 8th Infantry Division, as a combat medic. Now it's interesting he went into this profession, considering his morbid fascination with human and animal anatomy, but it was his exposure to drugs, the potency of drugs and their impact that they had on the human body that would later prove fatal to a number of his victims, as we'll find out later on in this video. But this also didn't last, and as was a consistent throughout his life, Dahmer failed at this as well and was honourably discharged in 1981 due to his alcohol abuse. And it was an honourable discharge because the army believed that his alcohol abuse wouldn't have any effect or impact on his civilian life, which is kind of interesting because just because you're in civilian life doesn't mean that you're suddenly not going to become an alcoholic again or give up alcohol. Now, upon becoming discharged from the army, Dahmer refused to go back to Ohio, decided to use his one-way ticket that the army give you if you leave to go to Miami and become an independent man. Again, this lasted only a mere 5 or 6 months before Dahmer lost his job at a deli where he was cutting meat. Bit of foreshadowing there. Was evicted from his flat for non-payment, again a consistent throughout his life, and ended up begging his father to move back to the family home in Ohio in September of 1981. Now, after only a mere few weeks of being back at the family home in Ohio, Dahmer was arrested for drunk and disorderly conduct, given a suspended jail sentence. Now, again, after his father Lionel unsuccessfully tried to get his son off his alcohol addiction, enough was enough, and they said, look, you're just going to have to go and live with your grandmother, who was the only person in Dahmer's family that he seemed to show any respect or actual genuine feelings for. Now, Dahmer moved in with his gran, and initially it was a harmonious and good relationship, despite him drinking and smoking heavily. But resorting to type, this didn't last long, and Dahmer was again arrested for indecent exposure at the Wisconsin State Fair Park, where many children were present. Now, this caused him to lose probably his best job of his career so far, which was a phlebotomist at the Milwaukee Blood Plasma Center. You know, building on his career in the army to get a decent job. Meaning he lost his independence and his life seemed to spiral even further downwards, and ultimately was losing control. That word again, control. Now, Dahmer relied on his grandma for the next 2 years for handouts because he didn't actually work in that time, preceding him losing the job at the blood center. Dahmer ended up being a frequent visitor of the Milwaukee gay clubs and gay saunas until his membership was revoked because he kept bringing guys back into these places and drugging them with sleeping tablets and molesting them while they were asleep. So, you know, it's no surprise that his memberships were revoked and he couldn't go back into these places. And I did tell you that his interest in these drugs during his time in the army would reappear. and they sure did. They raised their ugly head quite significantly. Now, his spiral downward didn't stop there, and this may be another peek into the darkness that was inside him. I mean, I know he'd murdered somebody already at this point, but this was even going further down the rabbit hole with Dahmer's psyche. He saw in the news an 18-year-old who had recently died. He found them really attractive, so decided to go and dig them up from the cemetery after their funeral. Fortunately, the soil was too hard and Dahmer ended up giving up on the thing. But I can't imagine what was going through his head to want to do that. Sadly, it was only just a year later that Dahmer would claim the life of his second victim, and a further 3 in the preceding years, up to 1990. Now, Dahmer's second victim, Stephen Twomey, was never actually supposed to die, according to Dahmer. Dahmer repeatedly told officers after his arrest that it was an accident, and he had no recollection of that situation. Which is interesting because, he didn't use this excuse for any of the other victims, and it, wouldn't have improved his situation anymore. So, why would he lie about that? Dahmer had met Twomey at a bar in November 1987 and invited him back to his hotel room at the Ambassador because, of course, he couldn't bring him back to his grand's house and his sauna membership had been revoked. Now, Dahmer, again, had only intended to drug him and explore his unconscious body, like he'd done a number of times in the past. However, after a night of heavy drinking and mixing of substances, Dahmer awoke to find Twomey's chest smashed in, completely caved in, and his body was black and blue with bruises, and there was blood seeping from his mouth. Now, looking down at himself, Dahmer realised that he had bruises on one forearm and his fists were covered in bruises. Now, like I said earlier, Dahmer had stated that he had no recollection of killing Twomey, and later told investigators, and I quote, he could not believe that this had happened. Now, with a bit more finesse than with the disposal of his first victim, Dahmer actually brought Twomey's body to his grand's house. He went out and actually bought a suitcase for this very purpose. He put Twomey's body in the suitcase, brought him to his nan's house before dismembering him in the basement. Again, filleting the bones and cutting the flesh small enough to be able to place into trash garbage bags for disposal. Just like with Hicks's body, Dahmer pounded the bones into dust. Now, this is where we start to see the Dahmer that we know. He retained the skull of Twomey, and again, disclaimer on how graphic this is about to sound, but he used it as stimulation when masturbating. However, the skull soon became brittle due to the bleaching process, and Dahmer later disposed of it. Now, his third victim, in January of 1988, came in the form of a 14-year-old Native American male prostitute, James Doxtertor. He lured the boy to his grandma's house with the promise of $50 to pose for nude photos. Sadly, a similar fate happened to this young boy, as did his previous victims, as well as Dahmer's fourth and fifth victims respectively, Richard Guerrero and Anthony Sears. There would have been another victim in between those, but fortunately Dahmer's gran interrupted the ritual, forcing Dahmer to take the young man to a hospital for treatment. Now, I'd like to say Dahmer somehow turned a corner after this because his murderous streak actually stopped, but it was only because he was convicted for the molestation of a 13-year-old boy and sentenced to a year in the House of Correction. Now, this was the end of the straw for his gran as well, who ended up kicking him out of her house too. I mean, she had a lot more patience than I would have had. But following his release from the House of Corrections in May 1990, Dahmer moved into the famous, or infamous, Oxford apartment, located on North 25th Street in Milwaukee, where 12 of his victims were murdered. Some speculated that due to the location of the apartment, conveniently situated in a predominantly poor black neighbourhood, without too much interference by the local police, something that later was given a lot more substance in the handling of one of Dahmer's future victims. Now, I can't believe I'm actually saying this, but within a week of Dahmer moving into apartment 213, he'd already murdered his next victim, 32-year-old Raymond Smith. Now, the following day, Dahmer went out and purchased a Polaroid camera and took several pictures of Smith's body posed in suggestive ways before dismembering him and again retaining his skull to keep alongside his fifth victim, Anthony Sears' skull. Now, when Dahmer was questioned as to why he kept these body parts, He said, and I quote, "It was my way of remembering their appearance, their physical beauty. I also wanted to keep. If I couldn't keep them there with me whole, I at least could keep their skeletons." Again, it's like this abandonment issues that I mentioned earlier, playing through from his childhood. Talk about foreshadowing. Literally a week later, Dahmer was on the hunt again, and the best way to refer to it is by being on the hunt, because there's no easing up with this man. Fortunately, this time he'd mixed the drinks up and was knocked unconscious himself, and then, upon waking up, realised he'd been robbed. So that guy, even though it sounds quite funny, got a lucky break. Interestingly enough, Dahmer didn't report that to the police. Now, over the next preceding 3 months, Dahmer lured his next 3 victims to his apartment: Edward Smith, Ernest Miller, and David Thomas, where they too were murdered and dismembered. He found Miller so attractive, he repeatedly kissed and spoke to his decapitated head while dismembering the rest of his 8th victim's body in the bath. He also ate a lot of Miller's body parts, including his heart and biceps. Now, Dahmer didn't murder again until the February of 1991, but that wasn't for want of trying. He did try and lure a number of young men back to his apartment like usual, but none of them bit, fortunately for them. He routinely told his probation officer of his suicidal thoughts. Now, was this due to being a product of his environment and deep-rooted psychological issues? Was it attention-seeking traits he inherited from his mother? Because remember, she did it on a number of occasions too, faking suicide to get attention. Now, I just want to caveat that with saying this is pure speculation on my part, so please don't take any truth from those statements. They're just merely questions, trying to get to the bottom of it. Now, Dahmer resumed his killings in February 1991 with the murder and dismemberment of 17-year-old Curtis Strafter. Now, apologies if I've mispronounced the name. It's either Strauter or Strafter, or Strauter. We retained the boy's skull, hands, and genitals, again photographing each stage of the dismemberment process. Less than 2 months later, Dahmer killed 19-year-old Errol Lindsay, who, unlike a lot of the other victims, was actually heterosexual. It was at this point where Dahmer started to conduct scientific experiments to sort of advance on what he'd been doing as a kid with the formaldehyde. He wanted to create, sort of living zombies with his victims, so they'd be in a state of complete submission, so he'd have complete control over them, but he wouldn't have to kill them. Included drilling a hole into Lindsay's head and pouring hydrochloric acid into it. Hydrochloric acid. The experiment didn't work, but Lindsay actually woke up during this process and complained of having a headache. I mean, you've got hydrochloric acid in your head. I'd be complaining of a migraine. A headache. That's the least of your worries. Dahmer didn't like this and drugged him again before strangling him. Following these killings, and where Dahmer was routinely dismembering his victims in his bath, the building's manager, Soper Princewell, received a number of complaints about the smells emanating from apartment 213. However, Dahmer always had an excuse. Whether it was his freezer breaking, the contents of whatever it was in there being spoiled, or even that his tropical fish had died. Now, it was Dahmer's 13th victim, 14-year-old Konorak Sintha-Somphone, that would be one of his most notable murders. I mentioned earlier the failures of law enforcement, and specifically within this neighbourhood. What you're about to hear will make you understand how truly awful it was. Unbeknownst to Dahmer when he approached this random 14-year-old, he was actually the younger brother of that 13-year-old he'd been convicted of molesting 3 years earlier. Now, whether Konorak recognised Dahmer from any sort of police investigations or being at the courtroom at the time or family discussion, I just don't know. It's unclear, despite Ryan Murphy's recent TV series stating that Konorak recognised Dahmer and was only agreeing to pose for these photos due to his family's dire financial situation. We don't know. But if that is the case and he needed the money, I get it. Unless you've been in that situation, you can't possibly understand what was going through the child's mind. You just don't know. So Konorak went back to Dahmer's apartment, and sadly a similar fate met him, as did Dahmer's 11th victim, Errol Lindsay. Dahmer first drugged the boy, drilled a hole into his skull, before this time injecting hydrochloric acid directly into the frontal lobe. He then led the boy into the same room where Tony Hughes's rotting corpse was still lying there on the floor 3 days after he'd been killed and started to drink heavily as Konorak passed out. Fortunately, which is a bit of a stretch to use that word, I can only assume that Konorak's state of mind, having been drugged and had hydrochloric acid injected directly into his brain, that he didn't realise Tony Hughes's body was there or even smelt anything. I mean, I've not had hydrochloric acid injected into my brain, so I don't know what sort of impact that would have on you, but it's crazy to think that Tony Hughes was just lying there and Dahmer brought the boy in with complete confidence, knowing exactly what was going to happen. Now, this is where Konorak's story and the failures of the Milwaukee Police Department became ever more apparent. Dahmer left Konorak in his apartment for a few hours while he went to drink at a local bar and purchase more alcohol. Now, upon returning to his apartment the following day, Dahmer was met by Konorak sitting naked on the corner of his street, talking in Lao. Now, the boy and his family are originally from Laos, hence why he was speaking in that language. And there were 3 distressed women standing around the boy, unsure about what was going on or how appropriately to look after him. Now, this is where Dahmer tried to take control, grabbing Konorak by the arm and trying to bring him back into the building, but the 3 women were having none of it. Told Dahmer that they'd already called the police and that they were on their way. Now, when the 2 Milwaukee police officers arrived, John Balsajak and Joseph Gabrish, Dahmer appeared actually to relax and told them that this 14-year-old boy was actually his 19-year-old boyfriend. And this was all just a complete mix-up and misunderstanding, and it was a lover's tiff. Now, the officers actually believed Dahmer's side of the story, as having only looked over the boy slightly, noticed a little graze on Konorak's knee and no real injuries or any reasoning to believe the 3 women that were there, which I find really strange because Dahmer had actually drilled a hole into Konorak's head. So how was that not noticeable? Plus, the 3 women pointed out several other injuries on the boy, including blood on his testicles, bleeding from his rectum, and that he actually struggled quite considerably against Dahmer's attempts to get him back into the apartment. Again, the 3 women were not giving up, but upon challenging the police officers, they were told to butt out and shut the hell up. Now, is this the sort of civic duty appropriate when 3 citizens are coming to the aid of a clearly distressed child? Not only were these 3 women ignored, but 3 members of the Milwaukee Fire Department also turned up and gave the boy a once-over. Now, one of them saw the wounds and said that he needed medical attention, but the police officers told these 3 members of the fire department to go away from the scene. They weren't needed. The police officers then helped Dahmer bring Konorak back up to Dahmer's apartment, where Dahmer immediately tried to validate him and the boy's fake relationship by producing the Polaroid pictures he'd taken of this 14-year-old boy in various states of undress earlier that night. The officers accepted this as evidence and, strangely enough, didn't even notice the odd smell that must have been coming from his apartment. Remember, Tony Hughes's body was still there, rotting in the bedroom. It just blows my mind how it wasn't noticed. However, later on, the officer Garish admitted that he'd noticed a strange smell that was similar to excrement coming from the apartment. But there was evidently blatant homophobia going on during this period, and was most likely the butt of a joke at some point. Awful. But, we'll never know for a fact. The officers then told Dahmer to, and I quote, "take good care of Konorak before leaving them alone." That one opportunity that poor boy had to escape, ruined by people that were there to help him. Now, as soon as Dahmer had the child to himself again, he injected him one more time with more hydrochloric acid. Sadly for Konorak, this proved to be the fatal dose. Dahmer then took the next day off work to dismember Tony Hughes and Konorak's bodies. Following this, Dahmer then went on to murder a further 4 victims before he was eventually caught. His arrest and what happened to Dahmer are the subject of the next part of this video. Now, on July the 22nd of 1991, Dahmer was up to his old tricks and approached 3 men with the promise of $100 to come back to his apartment and, again, pose for nude pictures, drink beer and simply keep him company. One of the 3 men, 32-year-old Tracy Edwards, agreed to this and went with Dahmer. Upon entering Dahmer's apartment, he was immediately hit by a disgusting smell. As soon as you watch the rest of this video, you'll understand why. But of course, Tracy had no idea why there was such a disgusting smell. He also noticed several boxes of hydrochloric acid in various parts of the apartment, which Dahmer brushed off as being used to clean bricks. Strange reasoning to have boxes of hydrochloric acid. After some small talk, Dahmer gestured to the tropical fish tank he had in his living room, to which, as soon as Edwards had turned his head, Dahmer slammed on some handcuffs. Fortunately for Edwards, Dahmer had only managed to connect it to one of his wrists. Tracy Edwards was like, "What are you doing?" And Dahmer said, "Well, this is part of the photo shoot. Let's go into the bedroom." Upon entering the bedroom, Tracy Edwards noticed a number of nude male photographs on the wall, that The Exorcist 3 was playing on Dahmer's bedroom TV, and a blue 57-gallon drum stood in the corner, from which a very, very strong smell came from. Now, of course, Tracy Edwards wanted to leave the apartment, but at this point, Dahmer was having none of it. He produced a knife and threatened Edwards with it. So, trying to appease Dahmer, Edwards unbuttoned a shirt and was like, "Okay, yeah, let's take some photos." But upon hearing this and that Edwards would comply with his request, Dahmer turned his gaze to the TV and began to rock back and forth, excuse the squeaky chair, rock back and forth whilst chanting something to The Exorcist. And then he slowly turned his head back to Edwards. I mean, super creepy. He then laid his head on Edward's chest to listen to his heartbeat, to which he then turned to Edwards and said, "I'm going to eat your heart." Now, I've got zero idea what was going through Tracy Edwards' head at the time. I mean, I can pretty much guess because of what's going through my head if I was ever in that situation, but he was not letting up on trying to appease Dahmer and find some way to get out of that place. He considered jumping out of the window, or running through the front door, which was actually, strangely, unlocked. Edwards finally convinced Dahmer to let him go into the living room because that's where the aircon was and it was better for him, better for them both, because it was quite a hot day, supposedly. So when they went into the living room, Edwards was also allowed to go to the bathroom. Now, upon leaving the bathroom, he noticed that Dahmer's concentration was lapsed a bit. So Edwards took this opportunity and full-on punched Dahmer in the face, knocking him completely off balance, and managed to escape the apartment. Now, after flagging down 2 police officers, he explained the situation to them, and they actually escorted him back to Dahmer's apartment. Fortunately, this wasn't to be a repeat of Konarak's murder, as these officers took the situation a lot more seriously. After being confronted by the officers at apartment 213, Dahmer had no real justification as to why he put the handcuffs onto Tracy Edwards' wrist. He merely gestured to the bedroom and said that's where the keys were kept, to unlock them. Now, as one of the officers tried to enter the bedroom, Dahmer actually tried to push in front, but was quickly told to back off by the other officer. Now, upon going into the bedroom, the officer found the large knife that Dahmer had used to threaten Edwards, as well as several Polaroids of his previous victims, where he dismembered them. Upon showing them to his colleague, they knew that they were real, and the actual wallpaper, or sort of the walls in the back of these photos, matched Dahmer's apartment. It was case closed for them. After putting up a bit of a struggle, Dahmer was actually quickly and quite easily overpowered and arrested. Now, this is an interesting part again of Dahmer's psyche. As he was pinned to the floor, Dahmer turned his head to the officers and said, and I quote, "For what I did, I should be dead." Now, a more detailed search of the apartment, conducted by Milwaukee Police's Criminal Investigation Bureau, revealed a total of 4 severed heads in Dahmer's kitchen. A total of 7 skulls, some painted, some bleached, were found in Dahmer's bedroom and inside a closet. Investigators discovered collected blood drippings upon a tray at the bottom of Dahmer's refrigerator, plus 2 human hearts and a portion of arm muscle, each wrapped inside plastic bags upon the shelves. In Dahmer's freezer, investigators discovered an entire torso, plus a bag of human organs and flesh stuck to the ice at the bottom. No wonder there was a disgusting smell coming from that apartment. Elsewhere in apartment 213, investigators discovered 2 entire skeletons, a pair of severed hands, 2 severed and preserved penises, a mummified scalp, and in that 57-gallon drum that Tracy Edwards noticed, 3 further dismembered torsos were dissolving in the acid solution that Dahmer had put together. A total of 74 Polaroid pictures detailing the dismemberment of Dahmer's victims were found. In reference to the recovery of body parts and artefacts at 924 North 25th Street, the chief medical examiner later stated it was more like dismantling someone's museum than an actual crime scene. Now think about that. I mean, it makes sense because if you know, upon reading some of the other research that I was going through, Dahmer was busy collecting these skeletons and body parts to create an altar. So it's understandable that it seemed more like a museum, the way he preserved everything and collected body parts and bones. Scary stuff. Now Dahmer, wishing to confess everything as he had, and I quote, "created this horror, and it only makes sense I do everything to put an end to it," waived his right to an attorney. Despite murdering 17 young men and boys, Dahmer was only found guilty of 15 of them, due to the relevant district attorneys only wanting to press charges on those killings that could be proven beyond a reasonable doubt, including Twomey's killing, which, like I said before, Dahmer consistently professed to not remembering. On February the 17th, 1992, with the death penalty having been abolished in Wisconsin way back in 1853, only one person was ever executed by the state, but I won't go into that in this video. Dahmer was sentenced to a total of 941 years in prison. Following sentencing, he was actually allowed 10 minutes of personal time with his father and stepmother to say their goodbyes before he was taken away to the Columbia Correctional Institute in Portage, Wisconsin. Now, similar to a lot of the other serial killers, it was reported that Dahmer tried to turn his life around in prison. He found Christ. He was even baptized in May 1994. However, only 6 months later, Dahmer would be dead. So during his routine work detail, fellow inmate Christopher Scarver, a convicted killer who was known to have frequent psychotic episodes, bludgeoned Dahmer, citing God as the reason for doing it. He said God actually came to him and told him to kill Dahmer. Dahmer was still alive after the attack, surprisingly, despite it being so brutal, and he was rushed to the hospital but died an hour later. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was cremated without a ceremony or service in September of 1995, and his ashes were divided between his parents, Lionel and Joyce. And that is the end of this grisly, macabre, and evil tale of Jeffrey Dahmer, the Milwaukee Cannibal. It was clear from anyone researching this case, Dahmer suffered a lot of emotional damage growing up. However, his family also seemed to support him, both emotionally and financially, especially his father, Lionel, and his grandmother, who, as you found out through this video, were there for him on a number of occasions where his life appeared to be quite difficult. So again, it begs the question, is this nature or nurture? Was Dahmer born evil, or was it a roller coaster of unfortunate events that led him down this dark path? That is unclear. But what is clear is that there were several failings on behalf of the police, and the homophobic and racist attitudes towards the LGBTQ+ and black communities at the time. It's only fueled and protected Dahmer's predatorial instincts. Sadly, none of this will bring back the young men and boys that fell victim to Jeffrey Dahmer. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed, to a point, the content and learned a bit more. Please like and subscribe if you did like it, and click the bell icon to stay up to date for any future releases. I'll see you on the next episode. Stay safe.